Okay, everybody, hello and welcome to our ninth show titled Whose Story Wins. I'm Matthew Abad. Our other host, who is just about to appear, is Tim Adam. This is our ninth show, but before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that this event is happening on Jara country. I'd like to pay our respects to the Jaja Wurrung community, custodians of the land, and to the elders and leaders past, present and emerging. We extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are also participating. We recognise that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Just to introduce ourselves, again, the Castlemaine Commons Collective is a small group in and around Castlemaine who came together in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown. We started off with this YouTube series, hoping to begin conversations that explore what's happening in this moment and where we want to go to. Today in our ninth show, we're going to look at narratives, what narrative is, how it shapes our understanding of the world, and how it goes a long, long way to determining the possibilities for the future. If it's not in the narrative, if we can't think it or imagine it or share it with one another, then it's very difficult to make it happen. To talk about this, I'd like to welcome our guests. First, Mark Chenery, Director and Co-founder of Common Cause in Australia. Kat Koff, who has been a star on several of our shows already, Yorta Yorta woman and local Aboriginal leader and a member of the Castlemaine Collective. Jude Anderson, founder and artistic director of Punctum. And Kyla Brethel, award-winning documentary maker, among many, many other things. Now to start off, bit of a technical beginning, we're going to offer a definition. That's because the word narrative is one that gets thrown around a lot. It can be used to describe anything from the plot of an epic book to a three-word political slogan. It gets used a lot. So the definition we're using comes from an outfit in the US called Narrative Initiative, and it uses the example of Jaws, the film about a human eating shark. So the film we describe as a story. The narrative that the story rests on is all sharks are deadly and terrifying. So a story about a shark, a single story, fits into a narrative that explains what sharks are about. And then there's also the deep narrative, which from the story of the shark and the narrative that all sharks are deadly and terrifying, really drives us towards fear of nature or fear of the unknown. It gets down to deep, more primal values. So sorry for that technical definition, but I feel we have to use it. We're going to be talking about narratives, sometimes jumping up to individual story, sometimes dropping down to deeper narratives and the values that they evoke or represent. But that's how we are, structuring the show. I guess there has been a lot of talk around what different narratives, what different stories, what different kinds of representations are happening about the experience that we're going through. It's very much a period of flux. It's a period where many of us are questioning and looking at, what is most important, which way we can go from here, and how we tell the story about COVID-19 and this experience really shapes our understanding of it and shapes, what we can imagine where we go to from here. So I'd like to just throw it out, just to begin quite openly, for any of our guests, put your hands up. What narratives about our experience in COVID-19 really jump out at you? How COVID-19 is being talked about, how the pandemic itself is being talked about and framed. What jumps out for any of you? Mark, you might want to kick off, but if you do that, you might want to unmute your microphone first. Thanks.
Yeah, for me, look, in terms of one deep narrative that COVID speaks to, I think is people are good or people are selfish. And I think we've seen stories that live up to both those narratives. Toilet paper makes us think about people are selfish. But then at the same time, groups like this and groups all around the country, community groups, neighbourhood groups looking out for each other, people who have found lots of time on all of a sudden on their hands, who are willing to spend that time looking after other people, the sort of volunteering that's gone on, all sort of speaks to a different type of narrative. And I think that's one of the key things here, is that you're never going to have just one narrative going on. There's going to be multiple narratives at play, and it's a question of, and this is sort of jumping ahead a little bit, but really for me the question is, what narratives do we want to be emphasizing and helping people interpret their experience through, and making that choice as wisely.
For me, a very local narrative that I've just observed, in the shopping centre in town. As a documentary maker, I'm always looking character as action, and what are the things that we do that express something about who we are and what we care about. And at first, yes, we did have the narrative of there's no hand sanitizer or toilet paper, and what does this say about us and what we care about and what we fear. And it was really lovely to see that narrative being replaced by, suddenly you can't get any seedlings or seeds or potting mix from ASQ, and there's no bread flour, there's no yeast. And this sort of spoke to me as people shifting from a very different mindset to thinking, okay, rolling up their sleeves and going, okay, we've got an issue, we need to deal with it, and dealing with it in a very sensible and also, environmentally sustainable way.
And there are very different impulses behind those two. I still don't really understand the impulse of the toilet paper, and I feel like it's been very, how many people were hoarding and so on and so forth. I have a bit of skepticism about this, but what was really striking is how much people were talking about it, whether it was happening everywhere or not. They believed it, and so that framed their understanding of it, which is what we're talking about. Jude, what has jumped out at you about how people talk about this experience and what kinds of meanings they put into it?
Well, I think that the one that has come through that I've found the most confounding is the notion of the great pause, because it feels like to me that actually it's been anything but a great pause for so many people, and for a plethora of reasons. But it feels to me like this notion of the pause was time to step back and reflect and think about, what you might want to learn, or how you can have self-time. And for so many people I know, it has been a time of we need to move now, and we have to get things done now, and we have to get together now, and we have just this opportunity now. So it's been quite an intense period, and not a moment of pause, but of great activity and great collectivity, great relating and relationships. And so that I suppose that's what has cut through as being a kind of contradictory notion of this moment.
There are, like Mark was saying, there are several different narratives, and they kind of jostle up against each other, and which some are in ascendancy at some points, and some are falling back, and then some have more resonance for different people, different individuals, different understandings. Kath, what's jumped out at you about just how people are understanding and talking about this experience, and how well it connects with what you see happening?
For me, there was sort of a narrative coming into it, and there's a different narrative coming out in some shape or form, even though we're not particularly out. Going into it, it seemed like, I found it really interesting as adults. We felt that it needed to be something outside our control that enabled us to live a life that we actually really secretly wanted to live. And it almost felt like we needed to be forced to be able to make decision, to not make the decision to nurture the spirit and to nurture ourselves at home. And the narrative going in, everyone seemed actually quite relieved and excited about this. And which was fantastic. And it was sort of like a relief. I found a lot of people were so relieved that they had that this was something that they just had to do. So that was really exciting. But I think there was sort of like the waves of emotions, and then during the time there was that level of, okay, going a little bit crazy at home, and this is, and trying to see it for what it was. But the other, I think, part of that process, and it's often not until you go through the awkwardness or that difficult time or that space where you just need to be still, coming out of the narrative is that how much we crave the connectedness with each other, how much we crave that interconnectedness of even just being in the same room or the same space as a person. Thinking that this sort of scenario is something that that might suffice for some. For a lot of people, it got to the point it's not the same, and it is that sense of how much we are connected to each other and how much we all crave that.
Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, what was really interesting for me is the difference between a narrative that's kind of been espoused as in this is the place we need to go, and Kath, what you mentioned, the space between that and the actual reality, what is actually happening, and that impulse to create those narratives and to kind of curate those narratives in a way. And I'm thinking of the, kind of narrative that we started with, which we were all in the same boat, that we're all going to be dealing with this together, and we all have almost by implication, the same kind of resources and the same kind of sense. I'm wondering, how that's kind of fractured over time in a sense, and how there's been people who have actively, spoken out against that, because that doesn't actually fit the kind of reality. I'm wondering, Kyla, if you've got anything to kind of comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's been really. I like for me, the coronavirus has really revealed so much about what is already broken within our society. I read a really great article about the US and how sort of so much is breaking down over there. And just from a sort of very local personal perspective, thinking about how parenting and looking after children and the incongruity of work and children, with the school day finishing so early, with holidays not corresponding in any way to working life. And it really revealed how difficult it all is. It's that sort of, we're already at a breaking point, and then the coronavirus sort of comes in and it all sort of spills out in that way.
Something that's struck me, and I think we all have different journeys into how we understood what was happening at different points. But something that struck me was very much early on, just a level of confusion, level of apprehension. What is going to happen? What does it mean? And sometimes there was very early fear. And then when the worst didn't happen and people stopped the hoarding and, it was much more obvious how much we were helping each other, then it shifted, at least in the mainstream discourse. I think there are lots of pockets where it's experienced quite differently, but then it shifted to much more cooperative, but it was still flux. We're in a time of transition and inflection point. Anything can come out of it. And here is what we hope come out of it. And those are some of the discussions we've been having. But now when we're getting to the next stage, and who knows, how long it goes on for, this is part of the unpredictability. This could be a very long process. Now, when we're getting to the next stage, my feeling is that people, particularly, established interests and so on, and governments, particularly from on high, is trying to force some clarity, saying, hey, we will snap back. Oh, hey, we will have a gas-led recovery, or we will do this. It feels like, we're on this period of flux. Now we're having various narratives pushed on us to try and say, hey, this is how you should understand it, and this is the way that means we should go forward. Is that something that also resonates for you, Mark? I can see you nodding your head there.
Yeah,
does that
absolutely.
make sense? Is that parallel your experience?
I think what the government is really keen to do is to frame this moment as the pause somehow, right? As a temporary disruption to business as usual that they want to return to. And the two key ways that they've been doing that is by framing this as metaphorically as sort of a container that we need to make our way out of. Eventually, we need to open it up. You know, it was easy to close down the economy. Now we've got to open it up. They talked about their, what was it, 3-step path back. It's all very much framed intentionally about returning to where we were. And I think they've done that because they realize that a lot of people are having exactly these conversations about, well, actually, this is a time to realize, well, were we where we wanted to be? And is there somewhere else we want to go? And they're very keen not to be having those conversations and framing it very much in people's minds as we just want to get back to where we were as quickly as we possibly can. And not open up the conversation about where do we want to go as a country and what opportunities does this actually open up in terms of different ways of doing things and being and so on. You know, you've got one, this is a story, but it connects to a narrative. SBS and news programs, or sorry, online news sites often have those pullover images where you can sort of, they normally use it after a tsunami or something like that, or a bushfire, where you see lush wilderness and all of a sudden you can see the before and after by dragging the slider over to see the devastation afterwards. Whereas what we've been seeing lately is being able to see the mountains from the city in China or in India or whatever it is. And I think there are all sorts of narratives emerging of actually when we slow down and do things differently, there are actually really wonderful, amazing things that are happening. I mean, me personally, being able to cycle with my daughters to their kindy or to places around where I live without having to worry too much about the cars on the street has been just absolutely, it was like the future I always wanted. And it's with a lot of sadness that the traffic has re-emerged as people have started to travel around more. And so I'm feeling like a sense of loss as we, you know, step out of this space that we've been in. And I suspect a lot of other people will be feeling similar things.
Kath, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, it's probably just completely, I suppose I'm just really aware that along with the this business, the COVID-19 business, is there's how the narrative was very different and still is going to be very different depending on your level of privilege. And the other interesting part to that is privileges. People that were privileged are not privileged. And at the moment, there's some people that used to never be privileged and because of job seeker increasing, that were never privileged, have all of a sudden had this moment in time where they've actually had more money than they've ever had. But I'm just really aware that for many people, this they've had a very different narrative, and a lot of what we're talking about, the beautiful experiences, that hasn't actually been the case for many. And to be honest, when people are saying that there was a pause, that means there was an ending. And for a lot of people, it's only just the beginning. They've lost their jobs, they've lost their way of income. When job seeker goes, that's going to be another time is a massive change for people, and even job keeper. That it's there's just, I suppose, the awareness that there's so many people that the narrative is actually quite harsher, and it's not a positive one.
And it feels like even just the phrase "snap back," you know, get back to where we were, is both a threat and a promise, depending on where you're coming from. You know, it's a promise if you're anxious and you're facing hardship, and that's resonating very strongly. But if you're not, then maybe it's a threat. You know, it's very conservative. You can't have the positive change that you might be imagining. It seems to gather up those different constituencies in 2 words, really.
And I suppose the other bit that I found hard, sorry, Matt, is that there's been a lot of talk now about why on earth would people go out and protest for Black Lives Matter within regards to COVID-19. There's a lot of people that have actually got very upset with people. And I've sort of said to them, have a little think. If that's what it means, actually, how much more, if they're willing to risk all this stuff, knowing all this stuff about COVID-19 and actually willing to do it, have a little think about why that's, you know, how important it is, and that sort of space. So that's been obviously recently another series and thing that's happening, and it's and yeah, it's another scenario of, you know, level of how you your perception of the world, and what's actually really important, and that people aren't making these decisions lightly. They're actually really heavy decisions, and they're doing it still anyway. So it's just on that other part of that business.
So, Jude, what do you think? Do you feel, I mean, this is my own sense, but do you feel that we're at a point where a definition is going to be forced upon us about how we should understand what has just happened, and where we should take it, where it should lead us?
Well, I feel that there's a dominant narrative that's constantly forced upon us. And that's a narrative of abundance through growth, and that we'll all be living abundant lives as long as the economy keeps growing, as long as we enable each other as individuals to grow. And that narrative hasn't changed. It's as Mark suggested, there was a bit of a pause, or a kind of a capsule that came over a moment for the government. But there are really cynical narratives out there, like, oh, how great it is that the stock market is bouncing back in a way that not even the economists had anticipated. And so the stock market is growing, and it will be abundant again. And our relationships with other countries of trade, whilst they're going through a bumpy moment, we are growing other relationships, and we are strong. And I think the space for a narrative that things are ever changing, things are interconnected, and things and this interconnectedness requires diversity, is a narrative that the government is really fearful of, because they never speak it. It's the classic narrative of divide and rule. And I think that in COVID-19, through COVID-19, what has happened is people have come together. They've found ways of coming together. And that connectedness, as we were talking about before, that connectedness, people have understood to be vital. And so the new narrative that I think has a lot of potential is the vitality that occurs through connectedness, and the importance of diverse connections. And people have lived that. I mean, Zoom is a classic example of diverse connections being built the whole time. So I think this narrative of growth that is kind of producing a kind of over dominance, and we're getting that in politics anyway, this over dominant narrative of growth, it's going to collapse. Over dominance will always collapse. And I think that it takes sometimes a long time for that to occur, or can happen very quickly. So the more there's connectedness and sharing of information through that connectedness, and care through that connectedness, the more it's in opposition to the hegemonic narrative, which is one of dominance through growth.
So if we're looking at this as a contested space, like you were just saying, Jude, there's been a whole lot of feeling of connectedness and togetherness, and that is a value, that is, you know, helping each other, very generous values. And the one coming from the top is countering that, you know, trying to erase or silence that. I mean, even if I totally take Kath's point, and we had a show on it earlier in the series about many people not feeling that kind of support, or maybe feeling much more pressure than others. But if the story that we're telling ourselves is about the connectedness locally, it's not so much a contradiction. It's like it's a violation. When I feel the connectedness in the community around here, and then I'm very conscious of certain groups that are being left out or being cut out or not being supported, that doesn't undermine what I'm feeling about what's going on in the community. It just makes me more committed to it because it's being violated for other groups. So that's a very strong value and a very strong narrative that's come out of our experience. But what we have is, you know, from the official orthodoxy trying to dull that. So I guess the question for us is, how well are we telling our different stories? How well are we telling that connectedness narrative? How prepared are we for this meaning that is being pushed upon us about how we should understand this and how we should react? How well are progressive campaigns or movements doing in the narrative stakes at this point when we're coming out of one phase and going into another? Does someone want to pick up on that one, Kath or Mark?
Yeah, I'm happy to have it. It's a really interesting one because so through our belief system, we're all about storing and teaching, and everything is all this interconnectedness, even in how we learn. But through this time, what I think is really important for people to be aware of is so many people are looking at, which is beautiful, the beauty and how we should all live life in the abundance and what we look for. But hasn't this time shown us also that life is so beautiful because you can feel everything at once? It's actually encapsulating everything. So you can go through moments of absolute love, passion, anger, hatred, pain. It's like poverty, richness. It's like I feel like sometimes it's let's if something we can get out of this is that life is so much wholer and richer in all that we can experience at the same time, because we've been doing that. Like, seriously, you nearly go from second to second sometimes, and my poor kids, but you know, it's just being able to experience it all and honoring it all as a whole, and that we don't need to live a superficial life that has just one part of it. It's everything. And again, what I was getting to, Matt, as a community, Castlemaine is beautiful. It has this richness, and it has this so many amazing people that you're talking about. You know, to talk about this abundance of in regards to a narrative, but also it has so much more and within it. So it's sort of like, let's not talk about this. Let's bring it out and talk in this space and bring all those truths into the same conversation, because it's not all beautiful, and that's actually okay. Some people are living hard. Some people are living hard that never lived it hard. So it's like just bringing it all in and opening it up. And I really honour Castlemaine that they can have that we could possibly be like that. There's enough open-minded people that we can stretch it out further like that. Am I making any sense?
You're making total sense. You're picking up very much on what Jude was saying about diversity, but actually it's not just diversity between different individuals, it's diversity in our experience as individuals, as members of a group, members of a family, whatever it is. It's making total sense to me. Mark, where do you think we're at in terms of how well are we able to push back against some of the more limited conservative narratives that we're starting to see more and more?
To be honest, I feel like I want to pause that question and come back to it in a moment, as in, you know, in a few weeks' time. I don't have a sense of it. I really don't have a sense of how we're responding. I know that we're asking lots of questions, and that's a good thing. My fear is that we will respond to the narrative that others set rather than set our own narrative, because that's what we've done a lot in the past, but maybe we won't. I'd like to be hopeful that we don't. And I think what will be happening and what has already started to happen is that various industries, for example, have started, and lobby groups are pushing for deregulation, they're pushing for tax cuts, they're pushing for all sorts of things that they already wanted, and are using this moment as an excuse to do that. And they're using a jobs and growth frame. That's the narrative that they're pushing, that we have to get the economy started. That is the primary thing that we should all be caring about. And I worry that what we will do in response is say, well, our solution is the best way for jobs and growth, as opposed to say, well, actually, is jobs and growth the metric by which we should be judging whether our society is doing well or not? And that for me is the key thing. What are the values that sit behind what matters and what our priorities are as we emerge from this, or however you want to metaphorically think about it.
So, arguing on their terms, you see as the biggest threat.
Yeah, I think that's the greatest risk, is that we won't set our own frame. We'll actually just respond to theirs.
And so what we're looking at is not only what are the contesting narratives, but what's being left out. What are the things that we should be talking about that we're not? Stories and whole ways of understanding our experience. That is what we leave out is possibly the biggest danger here.
Isla?
Just on that issue of connectedness and the stories and how well we're delivering that pushback. I think the Climate Council is doing a really great job in terms of framing what's going on as this is this huge cracking open of the egg, and that there are so many opportunities that are up there for grabs at the moment. And I think that's a really inspiring way to look at this and where we can run with it, and everybody's trying to take the ball and get as far as we can. In terms of COVID, I think one of the stories that's not getting so much attention at the moment is the connection between COVID and ecological destruction and also factory farming. It sort of speaks to our own human exceptionalism, that we're just so focused on our own health, our own economies, and slinging blame at each other, that we sort of, my fear is that the deeper meta narrative of climate change that underlies this event is not getting as much attention as perhaps.
So
connectivity, Tim.
So this is for Jude, because I'd like Jude to kind of answer this statement. So Alex Kelly's written, we really need to be creating progressive narratives that are absolutely bold. Look at the incredible gains of the BLM movement. Police being defunded and disbanded. Now is the moment to be bold. But I'm sure other people can talk on it as well, but I'm just interested in, Jude, what you might want to say about that.
Yeah, I agree. Being bold means not being responsive, but actually taking the lead on a narrative and being propositional. The question after that is, how do you bring people with you? Because you can have a bold narrative, but if you're not taking people along with you, then the boldness of your narrative just becomes, I suppose, something that you're repeating to yourself. So I think if I was to think about Kyla, the narrative, the climate crisis narrative, and the connectedness narrative, and Kath and Mark, what we're talking about in terms of that that moment where everything seems to be connecting and colliding, and how we can see a way through it. I think in that, the constant thing about ecology is that it's always changing. So the boldness of the narrative has to be something like, change is good, because we're in a dominant narrative which is entirely nostalgic at the moment, which is to say, let's bounce back or to where we were these kind of, or we'll get the economy going like it was before, and et cetera. But if we hold a narrative that links into the ecological narrative of constant change, where there's collision and connection and evolution through that, then the boldness that is required to accept change becomes embodied by everyone. And once something is embodied, then it's very difficult to shift. So I guess that's, that's just off the top of my head, like how you can embody a narrative that links you in a very primal way to how you relate to your interconnectedness with the environment, and therefore climate crisis. I think what people lived through the horrendous fire disaster, it's a piece of writing I read recently, was people understood the fragility of wildlife. There wasn't so much a narrative of loss, fortunately, around the human life loss. It was life lost. And that's a big shift in narrative. And communities that were lost, that sort of thing, and how we build, not rebuild. But it was life lost. And so a bold narrative for me is one where people are no longer fearful of change. And that change, constant as a constant, is a narrative, how we are capable of living with that, because we've shown it through COVID-19.
So Jude, I think it's very interesting, because what I'm hearing you say is that we need to embody it, and we may need to have a different idea about how we care for, take notice of, listen to narratives in some kind of way. And I'm struck by the notion that we already have so many other narratives out there. I'm thinking of, Kath, and lots of different Aboriginal, lots of narratives that come out of First Nations people, lots of narratives that come out of environmental movements, lots of narratives that come out of our own shows over the, around justice, around alternative economics, all those kind of things. So how is it that we kind of change our taste for narratives, if you like, our eating of narratives in a way that allows us to kind of listen more, embody, have a much more richer narrative rather than a very thin narrative? I'm wondering if, Kath, you've got your hand up. But
yeah, sorry, it's just on the boldness. I didn't want to move. I love what Jude said about the boldness in the primal business, because in regard to Black Lives Matter, that we have never seen such a way throughout the world in this space. And we have been saying these words for a long time, and we have been fighting for a long time. And it's almost like, what? Everyone's all of a sudden realizing it now. That's what it feels like. That's so primal, and everyone's being so bold. But can I to be totally honest with you, every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person, or every other First Nations person from around the world now, from today, is watching. We are watching for change. We had thousands, probably could have been millions, I don't know, across the world protesting on the weekend because the people had had enough and didn't think it was right. Today, Wednesday, we actually started watching Monday, because people, this is what we're worried about, is people walk the street. People feel the primalness of trying to, believing in it. But when Tim talks about what creates the change, and you talk about what people are used to, people fall back into that. After that, they feel they've empowered, they feel they've walked it, they feel they've protested. But ultimately, what we fear the most, is nothing will change, and that we'll be fighting this on our own again. And that's so we are all sitting back and watching, fatigued, absolutely exhausted. Like to go on this is because I just pure love job, because of the level of exhaustedness that I feel. But it's like, I really want people to be aware that we are watching to see what happens. We're sitting back to go, okay, I put a massive thing out there in regards to a narrative, a massive speech about what you guys could do, what other people could do to make change in this community, in Victoria. You couldn't get much more localised. So we're actually standing back, and today I had a teacher tell me she didn't know what she could do. And I'm like, are you joking? Like, this is what? So it's actually like, what has to happen in order for people to make the change you're talking about, Jude, to actually act? Because we do a lot of talking, we do a lot of hearing and nodding, lovely, it's all lovely, but it's the action. And that's what we want to know, what can create that shift to act. And it's the same in regards to climate change. It's in regards to anything that people have this passion for it, but then they don't. Why does it not continue? Why do people not push? I know there's a lot of people here that do, but as a mass, I'm talking, you know, as a majority, that's probably where we're sitting. I totally agree with all that you guys are saying. It's like, but what actually can change it, that people are willing to act and wake up? That's, yeah.
So that connection between narrative and change, and how can we kind of cement that? I'm wondering, Mark, whether you might have, oh, sorry, Carla.
I just want to make the point that that narrative, traditional 3-act narrative, which is, you know, we should also contextualize as being very Western, is all about change. It's all about how life changes from one state or condition at the start of the story, and then we have exactly the same theme at the end, but it's changed. It's changed to another. And you know, story is action. It is a demonstration. Someone doesn't tell you that they're selfish. We see through their actions, and I think that's one of the things that makes it incredibly powerful as a tool. But it's that process of moving stories out of our imagination and into our lives.
Mark.
Something that you were talking about, oh, sorry, Mark, were you going to?
I would just say on that, often what we focus on in our narrative is the problem. We talk about the problem and the depth of it, and I think a lot of the time we do that because we think if people realize just how big and how horrible the problem was, then surely they'd be motivated to act. And actually that's true of supporters, of people who are already committed to the cause. You know, they hear another statistic about how horrible the problem is, and that fires them up even more and gets them active that day. But what tends to shift people from sitting on the sidelines to actually being supporters and actually doing the things that they need to do is often understanding the solutions, is hearing the solutions, being able to picture those solutions and thinking, well, why don't we have that already? And I think another thing that COVID has done, which is useful for us, is that it is broken that sort of the whatever was remaining of this idea that there is no alternative, that we have to do things the way we've always done things because that's how we do them. And if we stop doing things the way we're doing them, the whole world will collapse in one big heap. And I think that when big things like this happen, I think the bushfires were similar. This is doing it again, is just saying that actually life goes on, things keep happening, and they're working differently. And we can actually do things in a different way to how we've ever done them before. And so even though I'm not sure if we want to lean too much into the fact that, you know, hey, look, we listen to scientists for once and look what happened. We're all stuck at home with our kids screaming at us and we're screaming at them. But what it does show is that we can do things. When we want to do it, we can do it. And I think that's a really important possible narrative shift here, that actually things don't have to be the way they've always been, and radical change is actually possible, but we have to funnel that into sort of solutions that are aspirational for people as opposed to who wants to spend more time at home.
Isn't there a danger though in part of this COVID narrative in Australia at least, is that we pat each other on the back because we've survived so well and we've done all the right things. And, you know, as a community, we've pulled together and there's all this kind of other fluff around it. However, isn't it also partly luck that we were, you know, 9 or 10 days away from being in Italy? That if we hadn't acted, if we hadn't, that we just had this bit of lag time that allowed us to pull things together. And then in fact, it's not necessarily, you know, all us great Australians who do all this wonderful thing and that we've managed to pull it together, but that it's only through a bit of luck, and that we actually have to create a future. we need to work towards a future rather than that action-orientated stuff that Kath has, everybody's spoken about, but Kath pointed to very, very directly, that we actually have to work towards the future. It isn't just something that is, you know, there's a great deal of luck in terms of how we've survived this. Kyla, have you got anything, any comments on that? I saw you nodding, either disagreeing or...
No, I think we're definitely in danger of feeling smug here and seeing our narrow escape thus far from the first wave as you know. I definitely think that's a problem, and it sort of disguises the fact of the deeper problems at play that we really need to address and deal with.
Mm-hmm. Kath, I think you might have something coming up that you might have to leave us a little bit early.
I'm so sorry. I'm actually really upset and I'm going to start crying, so I have to go. I'm sorry.
Yeah, look, thank you so much for joining us. Totally. It's been a rough, well, more than a rough couple of weeks. I think we did have, as something that we wanted to look at, was the degree of change, the enormous degree of shift that is Black Lives Matter in the US, but obviously reverberating all out, and seeing that from a narrative perspective. I think something that was just really, really striking was how it has just totally changed the coverage of everything that's coming out of the US. It's totally shifted the topic of conversation. And at one stage it was, I think this is an example of its power, and Alex has been saying a couple of things in the chat. At one stage, it's been treated as something that happened just at the time of COVID, you know, not necessarily connected. But I think from everything that people are saying here and everything that we're reading, their story, their narrative in Black Lives Matter really makes that connection very, very clear and connects it further back. You know, Black Lives Matter, we don't have healthcare because of the injustice, the structural injustice, structural racism. Black Lives Matter, you know, we're getting abused and murdered by police because of that same injustice. Therefore, defund the police, fund our healthcare. It's a very, very tight, powerful story with enormous mobilization behind it. For me, that's an example of just being able to break through the stories that have been established in the mainstream and really set the agenda. It's built on so many years of organizing, but as well telling a very powerful story. I wondered if other people had reflections on the degree of shift they've been able to achieve, how that relates to what we're seeing in the US and how it relates back here. Are there lessons from Black Lives Matter, what we're seeing over the past couple of weeks, and what we're talking about here about how to make change ourselves? Just a small question. Yeah, Jude.
And so this is a small answer. I think what shifted was the graphic visual of the cop that murdered an innocent person, and that went viral. And it was really disturbing footage. And the fact that the narrative around that was, but this happens every day in the context of America, then it brought it to people on their phones in the middle of the day. You know, it was the graphic image that then found echoes in images all around the world of where injustice and systems were cruel and tragic loss came out of that cruelty. And this is in a time when people were asking questions about how they can care for each other. So in the context of questions of care came a rush and a propensity for solidarity. And there was this excruciating image of white supremacy and injustice. And how that captured people's spirit of solidarity, I think, was a context of quite a few things, but it might be a way of understanding the power of that movement in that moment. And as Kath says, now, you know, we're watching to see what change is going to happen. And if we have a narrative of equity and interconnectedness, then I think that through change, that will keep working, because that's what's happened in that moment as well.
I think something that's come through a lot for me, just in a whole lot of the contributions so far tonight, often when we talk about, you know, struggle for narrative, who's winning, who's becoming more dominant, it's really feels a little bit like who's shouting the loudest. But a lot of the time, in terms of how we really build a strong narrative that brings us together, it's more about how well we're listening to what different people, different groups are saying. Different individuals, different people that we know. And I think this was something, Kyla, that you were talking about as well earlier. It's not just about, you know, how loud or how many people shout on social media, whether you manage to drown someone out. That's kind of like the opposite of what we're talking about. It's really about sharing the stories, listening to one another, and a narrative can be built out of that rather than necessarily constructed, you know, just out of choosing a few choice words and then pushing out as hard as you can.
Certainly. I mean, I think the internet and the cataclysmic sort of change that it wrought on broadcast media and the broadcast industry, whereas you no longer had to have money and training and a broadcaster behind you in terms of sharing your story. I think that's opened up wonderful, incredible possibilities for shared narratives, for collective narratives, participatory narratives, and, you know, looking at more experimental, less, you know, white male through the passive landscape, getting upwards and upwards on the narrative trajectory. It's cracked open that egg of exploring different types of narratives. But as you say, at the same time, you know, when someone's there and their mouth is flapping away and words are coming out of it, they're not listening. And we have so many people sort of standing up and wanting to talk, and we really need people to listen. And I think in lots of ways that gets back to Jude's point of the political power of connectedness, and you know, and it demonstrating its power through you know, through the bushfires, you know, through COVID, through Black Lives Matter, and this intense uprising. It's yeah. I mean, I
think there's a question relayed by Alex from Emma in the chat, which I think is stuff that we've been touching on throughout, where we had the narrative around care. Jude, you were mentioning that. But then people who are not receiving the support, it just highlights the inequalities that they're already experiencing. We've talked about this with COVID quite a lot. It reveals the inequalities, it reveals what's broken. And so this has also given, the question is whether this has also been something that's really given Black Lives Matter as so much of its power in this moment, just in terms of really, you know, highlighting, exacerbating what it means, what the inequality means, what the suffering from that means. Do others also feel that this is, one of the reasons why it's gained so much prominence so quickly, both the US and here?
So I wonder.
Well, sorry, Tim, go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead, Jude. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say you've summed up pretty much what I was thinking, Matt. And the short answer is yes, I do. I think we have a heightened awareness of care at the moment, whether that be the system of care, the nurses and everyone within the health area. In a health system, you're regarded as client. I was talking about this last night at home, and I think something in this moment has broken that down, and we're all in a context of needing different levels of care. And I think people are listening more to how the needs of others and how they might care for that. And it has opened up inequalities, but we're still alert, I think more alert to those inequalities and what we can try and do to bring about a resolution to that inequality, because we are fundamentally connected through our capacity for care, as one example. So yes, I think it has opened up an awareness of the necessity for that. It's crucial in a health crisis that we care. And so suddenly everything that we need to care about, we're caring more about. But we need to then change things. So there are other steps now that we need to move into action now.
So Jude, I'm hearing that kind of, that care narrative and how that binds rather than divides. And I guess I'm aware that we've only got a few more minutes left, so we'll just finish. We'll just kind of, I'll ask one last question. It is interesting around narratives that are primarily meant to kind of divide and win, lose. We've got to beat them. We've got to do this, as opposed to narratives around listening or narratives around care. And I guess that kind of begs the question, a much broader question around narratives is, what do we gain from looking at what's happening with the narrative lens, in terms of bringing that kind of level of analysis or understanding? And what are the strengths and perhaps the dangers that we might fall into when working with a narrative and in efforts for social change? I'm wondering, Mark, if you'd like to start off with.
Yeah, I've got so many thoughts. Which one should I go with? I think where we can fall down. Well, okay, I'll be positive. I'll be aspirational.
Right.
Where we can do well is actually I do find it quite useful to examine the narrative of our opposition. How are they framing things? And often that's a bit of a cheat, because they're often doing it quite intentionally. And that doesn't mean that we then respond to their narrative. It just tells us this is the narrative we need to stay well clear of. And if that's their narrative, what is the opposite is often the cheat I use to figure out where should we be. An example of that is in with the bushfires over the summer, where a lot of sort of climate advocates were using a war metaphor for the fires, and sort of linking that to climate change. And climate change is a war, and we need a warlike mobilization. And I was always worried about that, because that sort of war and fight metaphor is something that's typically much more comfortable amongst right-leaning politicians. And sure enough, after Morrison returned from his lovely holiday in Hawaii, one of the ways that he recaptured the narrative was by sending in the military to deal with the problem, which we had just beautifully set up for him. So I think that's what we can do, is we can pay attention to how the opposition is trying to, what story and narrative they're trying to tell, and make sure that we're not accidentally giving them a free kick.
So that kind of, really looking behind the narrative and being very, very careful. The war narrative tends to get a bit overused, but it's also about, we have to beat this thing, rather than how do we live with it? How do we work with it? How do we do a whole range of things? Kyla, I'm wondering what you have to say.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's a fantastic point. Really, narratives are embedded with a value and a cause of how this change is achieved, and what change it is, and whether we want that, and we need to be very aware and keep a fluid viewpoint about where stories are coming from and what values that they're actually pushing. But on the positive side of narrative, and why I wanted to become a documentary maker in the first place, is I think narratives and stories are wonderful ways through which we connect on a very deep emotional way, and is a path through which we're able to experience things that otherwise we would never have any idea about. And narratives in lots of ways can be a key to empathy. And people can connect to each other via narratives and develop shared narratives, and that can be a really powerful thing.
Thank you, Kyla. And what I'm hearing is that kind of, empathy is an enormous binder. We can use that to help bind and work together, rather than divide, I guess, is that other bit that, yeah. Now, Jude, would you like to finish off kind of answering that question about the, power of narratives and the good, bad and the ugly?
Well, I think narrative carries in it all of that, the good, the bad and the ugly. And if it doesn't carry in the good, the bad and the ugly, then it's not a narrative, because a narrative always carries the question, what's at stake? And that gives the narrative momentum. So if we can understand what's at stake from a whole lot of different perspectives, as Mark, you were suggesting, and Kyla as well, the empathy comes through an empathetic reaching out to a person or a thing or a situation where there's a lot at stake. If we can consider always the balance of humanity at stake through a narrative, then I think we have a course through it that will give hope. And I think no narrative has the right to take away hope. And I think that that's a sort of fundamental place through which we can read narratives. If someone's narrative takes away hope, then it's a flawed narrative. It's propaganda or something like that.
Yeah. And maybe coming back to Kyla's original point about those kind of stories that we're so used to, is that does involve change. It does involve that kind of starting with something and then ending with something a bit different and often better, except for those dystopic novels, which are very, very different. So it's probably pretty close to us actually finishing.
Shall I take us out to beginning? So I'd just like to say thanks to all our guests. Thanks to everyone watching and your contributions in the chat. Thanks to everyone at Castlemaine Collective, all of us who have been working on this, which is the two of us, myself and Tim, plus Natalie, Emma, Alex, Catherine, Declan, and Jessie. We'll be back at the same time next week, and Natalie has just joined us to tell us about that. Natalie, what's happening next week?
Yeah, so the Castlemaine Collective, the Castlemaine Commons Collective just kind of formed rapidly in response to the pandemic to have a Castlemaine people talking a lot about using a lot of narratives, really. I've learnt the word narrative, I was new to it, but harnessing that narrative in our community, and we've managed to cover heaps of different topics, and we've had an amazing array of guests. And it's been quite a beautiful journey. The final show in our series of 10 shows is next week. We're inviting you to come along to that. So it's show 10, and it's about the commons and what do we do now? So how do we now take action? We're going to look back quickly over the shows and ask people what change from those shows, what change has emerged for you, and what's emerging in our community that we could potentially act on. And then we're going to facilitate a conversation with a number of people, including most of the collective members, around how might we act better together. So that's our final show. And then after that, we're going to contemplate what we do next. So thank you, everybody. And we really look forward to hearing you in the chat and on the Zoom next week.
Thanks, Natalie. Now, just taking us out, we have an entirely different narrative. We've used these guys before in previous shows, but they're a bit too good not to. This is, in case any of us have forgotten, what an honest government ad looks like. Tim, I think you can start it off. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm from the Australian government. As we head into the worst economic recession in living history, what the nation needs now is leadership, evidence-based policies and bold vision. And fucked if we have those. So instead, we've cooked up something else. That's right. While you've been in lockdown, we too have been busy baking. No, not sourdough. Shit fuckery. The kind your grandkids will still be tasting decades from now. Introducing our Disaster Economic Recovery Plan. DERP. Brought to you by the empty ball sack of ideas that is Scott's ministry. DERP will take the money we have for our economic recovery, the one chance we have not to lose a generation to a lifetime of hardship, and throw it in a fucking volcano. Or to put it in lay terms, give it to the gas industry. Gas is what's called a transition fuel. It fuels the transition of dollars from public coffers into the bank accounts of private companies who pay no tax and create shit tons of emissions. Will it create jobs? A volcano would literally employ more people through tourism and provide cheaper heating bills, since the volcano can't be exported overseas, which is exactly what we do with gas and the reason you pay so much for it. Is DERP supported by experts? Yes, the ones we've appointed to our advisory committee, which we've stacked with former gas executives, mining lobbyists and chinless neoliberal spivs. Oh look, there's even a director of a Saudi oil company in there. Cool and normal. Actual experts are saying that instead of DERP, we should invest in renewables, since our own science agency shows they're performing better than coal and gas. But Angus said, fuck evidence. Let's invest your money in bullshit solutions like carbon capture, which no credible study says will ever work, but which gives his mates a boner because it lets them keep polluting and making the ching-ching. Fantastic, great move. Well done, Angus. Others are saying we should look to history for answers. Remember that time the US government ended the Great Depression by spending massively on a strong social safety net and employing people to build shit tons of stuff? Bridges, roads, hospitals. If only there were an urgent need today for a similar nation-building project, such as decarbonising our economy, which would bring back to our shores high-tech manufacturing jobs, employ millions, and at the same time ensure a living planet for our children. Nope, can't think of one. Besides, we can't afford all that. Well, we could pay for it with the money Josh found behind the couch last week after realising he underestimated JobKeeper by $60 billion. Whoops. And there'd still be enough left over to bail out all those who missed out and not cut New Start back to poverty levels. But why do all that when we can subsidise an industry that manufactures fuck all, apart from holes in the ground and continent-scale bushfires? In order to feed you this turd sandwich, we'll be moving things along fast to try and overwhelm you with shit fuckery. Oh look, we just approved a new coal mine while you couldn't protest, because the last thing we want is for you to have time to realise how important this moment of history is, how consequential our choices are at this crucial juncture, and come together to stop us from wasting it. with Derp. Join us next week for more shitfuckery we cooked up while you're in lockdown, like our handout to renovate rich people's homes instead of public housing and those who lost theirs in the fires. Australian government. Lol, we're going to get us all killed. Authorised by the Department for Wasting Historic Opportunities.